Welcome back to the Messy City podcast. This is Kevin Klinkenberg. I'm delighted to have my longtime friend and colleague, Philip Bess, here with me today. Phil, it's great to see you. It's been a long time since we've talked.
It has been. It's great to see you too, Kevin.
Phil and I first got to work together or know each other years ago when I think the first time was you were part of the charrette, the design charrette that was organized in Ada, Michigan, with our friend John Anderson, which has been a minute or so ago.
Golly,
I can't. So, refresh my memory now. At that time, were you teaching at Andrews, or were you in Chicago? What was going on?
Okay, so I was living in Chicago and teaching at Andrews. I taught at Andrews from 1993 to 2003 through 2003, and first 2 years there, I was a visitor, and then I became a permanent faculty member. And so I think the charrette was in 1999.
That sounds right,
if I'm not mistaken, and which was also the first time that John and I had ever worked together.
Yeah.
So it was a real it was a real ad hoc situation. We learned a lot in Ada. I think we gave them good work, but we also learned a lot.
And it was the origin of the infamous Dogbark Plan. So, do you remember the Dogbark Plan?
No, I'm losing brain cells. Remind me.
So, and this just became a little legend in our many new urbanist charrettes afterwards. But it was at one point it was decided. So this was a charrette in a rural area outside Grand Rapids, and it was to look at basically how the area could develop in a more village-oriented or pedestrian-friendly manner. And at one point, it was decided that somebody needed to draw the plan of what would happen if it would just all build out as kind of typical suburban development. Do you remember that part? Yeah.
Yeah. No. That absolutely. That was part of the MO.
And there was, like in many charrettes, there was a dog who was part of the charrette and just hanging out the whole time. And when that plan was started printing out of the oversized printer so that we could display it, the dog started barking at it. And so henceforth, anytime we were in a charrette that we wanted to draw, here's what's going to happen if we don't change anything, here's the typical sprawl plan, it became known as the Dogbark Plan. So
the Dogbark Plan. Yeah. So I must have been at some smaller intra-charrette meeting getting harangued by the head of the school superintendent of the public schools that their suburban MO was non-negotiable.
Yeah.
Another lesson learned.
Yes.
It was that and constructed wetlands.
Oh God, yes.
Anyway, good times.
We did learn a lot there, and many things that we were able to later on deal with and correct in other projects. But
absolutely,
it's the only way you learn. So, Phil, for the last 20 years or so, you've been teaching at Notre Dame, right?
Correct. Yeah, since 2000. It'll be 20 years in January.
And you're actually getting ready to retire.
I'm going to call it officially. I'm going to go emeritus on July 1st.
All right. So why don't you talk a little bit, just, for anybody who doesn't know you, what you have been doing at Notre Dame. I mean, you were, we've had many, many conversations over the years. And one of the things that is unique about the teaching that you've done and the work that you've done is you are, for just lack of better terms, we can define them or say whatever you want, but more of a traditionalist in terms of your approach to urban design and architecture in a world of academia where that's incredibly rare. And you've taught both on the urban design and the architecture front. Is that right?
Yes, although primarily on the urban design front. And it's interesting. This was something that I began developing an interest in the mid '80s, and I taught as a visitor in a variety of places during the '80s. And the '80s was a period of time when you could actually to be a traditional architect and a traditional urbanist was not automatically disqualifying in academia, and that lasted from about the late '70s when I'd started school. Until about 1990. And in 1990, the door kind of slammed shut for traditional architects doing visiting things. And I actually did some odd jobs over a period of a couple of years. And then I went to work at Andrews as a visitor, which didn't really have a program. It was little Seventh Day Adventist school in Southwest Michigan that had a new program, but it didn't really have a culture of architecture and uh, uh, and and over the course of 10 years with the working with Lou Seibold and some other folks at Andrews who were really quite good colleagues. We nurtured a program there. Andrew von Marr and a
Mhm.
number of other people who came through the program and who eventually became they took over a lot of the teaching leadership in the program and just really made it good. They won all kinds of CNU awards and they really I want to say they put Andrews on the map, but Andrews isn't really interested in being on the map. Andrews is interested in doing good work. They kind of go out of their way to not be on the map, but the work was so good that it couldn't go unnoticed. And then I went to Notre Dame 20 years ago, but beginning at Andrews and then also beginning at Andrews, I was working with colleagues who were interested in trying to make a coherent architectural curriculum that engaged both durable construction. At Andrews, it wasn't so much classical, although when Andrew came and started working there, he extended the program because he had done a master's degree at Notre Dame
Mhm.
before he came, and he'd gotten classical training. He and his wife Kristen, and so for reasons I won't go into here, there's less interest in classical architecture at Andrews than at Notre Dame, but there's a lot of interest in composition, right? And so the Andrews students didn't pursue classical architecture per se, but they were pursuing building good, durable and beautiful building that was really informed by rules of classical composition, and as importantly, if not more importantly, they were looking at architecture and building in the context of human settlements.
Mhm.
And that was another interesting issue because Adventists don't have a real, um, I would say, affection for big cities, but they in sort of working out the nature of the curriculum, they recognize that the physical form of city neighborhoods and the physical form of small towns, it was the same basic kind of structure, with the
Mhm.
only difference being not even extent, but geographic extent, but of being density,
Right.
and so and also they recognize the small town as a physical form of community, and that the urban neighborhood was as well, and because they are themselves a community, they kind of got the relationship between the urban design or the town planning, however you want to walkable mixed use settlements. They got the connection between that and the good architecture. And so going to Notre Dame for me was I went with mixed feelings because the situation at Andrews, I really it was a really good bunch of people at Andrews that were doing really good work. But Notre Dame was an opportunity to grow the graduate program,
Mhm.
and so the first 10 years that I was at Notre Dame, I was the director of graduate studies, and we initiated a curriculum that kind of focused both on their classical architecture practices of about 10 or 15 years when I got there, and urban design. And at Notre Dame, it's a little weird because you'd think there'd be this close connection between traditional architecture and traditional urbanism, but there wasn't. There was
Mhm.
some division about that, and I tried uh, with some success, but also not completely successful to kind of bring both of those sensibilities into play within the graduate curriculum.
Mhm.
So um, uh, I stepped down from that, not entirely voluntarily, uh, about 10 years ago. But those emphases remain, I
Yeah.
think, on classical and we call it classical and traditional architecture and urbanism because we can't come up with a more concise
Yeah, that's a mouthful.
definition that everyone can agree on. So,
That's a mouthful. Well, there's a number of things I wanna talk about today, including our shared interest in baseball, but I do wanna talk a little bit about academia first 'cause I suppose it's just more of a personal thing for me. I've
mhm,
often tried to describe for people, the bizarre world that architecture school is and architectural education. I think most normal people would think that you go to college and you're learning all about, you're basically just learning the basics of building and construction and, how to lay out spaces and everything else. And they have no idea that it's basically like a Stalinist groupthink cult that pursues one design process or one design aesthetic. And I'm curious why, with all the years that you've had in academia now, you talked about how the change that happened in the early 90s that really kind of closed the door to a lot of architects who don't see the world that way, who really appreciate the traditions of architecture that we had for hundreds of years. Why do you think that is? Why did that happen? And from your perspective, why is there such a strong cult of just strictly contemporary or modern architecture in academia?
Well, I wouldn't even really characterize it as modern or modernist architecture, and here's why. And this is a kind of if it becomes too academic an answer, you don't hesitate to cut me off. But so I have a theory. So postmodernism, right, was a kind of architecture culture, architecture school culture revolt against modernism. That and a modernism that had been an avant-garde thing and that had become a kind of corporate American thing,
Hmm.
became the architecture of Manhattan
Right.
and Chicago, developers and so the postmodernism resulted in a certain degree of freedom where you could engage history again, but you sort of engaged history uh, in a grab bag sort of way. And so you could be a kind of traditionalist postmodernist, or you could be a kind of deconstructionist postmodernist. But you could allude to things, and so all of that existed, in the context of this 15-year period or so between about 1975 and 1990. And then the modernists kind of closed ranks. And I want to say, and so the kind of standard narrative about what postmodern architecture is that postmodern architecture was this transitional period between uh, sort of modernism one and modernism two. And that it was kind of a silly season, and we're just going to do away with it. And so, and especially we do away with sort of the historical interests and concerns, and even the study of history to a large degree.
Hmm.
And that's kind of the narrative that exists within architecture school, is that postmodern architecture was a transitional thing. But my take is a little different, which is that, and it's interesting. So Nathan Glazer, who was this public intellectual, he was a kind of a neocon. In other words, he was a Harvard sociologist and a Democrat, generally, what do I say, an FDR, kind of liberal, and a modernist. And he was a contemporary and a friend of Daniel Patrick Moynihan, um, and uh, and he had a real interest in cities. And he wrote this book, which is a collection of his essays. The book was called uh, "From a Cause to a Style: Modernism and the History of American Planning," or something like that. Modernism in the city, in the American city, and but the basic thing, it was this collection of essays that he'd done over about 20 years. And it was really interesting to see the trajectory, because he says, he self-identifies as a modernist. And he writes, a little bit later, he starts writing about the bad effects of modernism on cities. And I think he'd grown up in Manhattan, or at least in New York City. He taught at Cambridge. He was active in Washington, D.C., in public policy kinds of things. And so he had a lot to say about the physical environs of those three major East Coast cities. And it was evident in the trajectory that he was having real reservations about modernism and their effects upon the physical form of the city and kind of the character, and it was just and so the basic thesis and what he was lamenting was that modernism, which had been this revolutionary ideology, had all of a sudden become this kind of corporate bland thing. It was just a stylistic thing, and he was trying to write about that. And he's asking himself the question of how that happened. And toward the end, he's starting to say things like, and you notice that these old, American city, beautiful, buildings and their compositions and their little urbanistic uh, interventions, that these still stand up and they still really work really well. And you can see that he was kind of on the verge, because he says when he starts, he says confesses to being a modernist. He says when you're young, who's not?
Which is kind of
But
true.
as he,
So
it's kind of true, absolutely.
it
And
appeals to
so
the idealistic nature of young people.
right,
Yeah.
right. Well, and of course, and everybody all the people who started the new urbanism were
Hmm.
educated as modernists,
Yeah,
right? And so
absolutely.
they were kind of seeing. So what he was experiencing is what a lot of us were experiencing. And anyway, my sense then is that what modernism today is not modernism. So the modernism that Glazer was describing, he described it in somewhat the same terms that Colin Rowe did, which was it had a telos, it had an end, it had a view of history, it had a notion of progress, it sought a utopia. And so Rowe made a distinction between the kind of the classical utopia that was transcendental and it was ideal references, and it wasn't expected to be realized in history except as these kinds of collages, as fragments. But that for the modernists, it was a political program, and it turned out to be a bad political program for two reasons. One is that the environment was kind of ugly, and the other was that it was kind of totalitarian.
Hmm.
And so uh, modernism too. I should say, yeah, modernism too is really what I would characterize as hypermodernism. That modernism and the tradition had in common an end, a telos, but the new modernism, or what I call hypermodernism, does not. That hypermodernism is not teleological. It's entirely about self-expression.
Hmm.
It's entirely about novelty. It's entirely about doing something that hasn't been done before. And the inference that I draw is that it's modernism, not postmodernism, that was the transitional period,
Hmm.
and that we're in this period now of basically, it's basically the architectural education and the architectural avant-garde is basically novelty in form making. But what's related to modernism about it is it still uses modernist methods, materials, and means of construction.
Hmm.
But the difference is that for modernism, that was actually part of the ideology. That was a charged thing. And the hypermodernists of today, they just take it for granted that this is how you build. And it has all these bad adverse environmental problems, but it creates a kind of incoherent public realm that is really a kind of symbol of crony capitalism, because it's not just capitalism, it's not just totalitarian government,
Hmm.
it's capitalism and the government working together to make this kind of environment.
Right.
So that's what we're fighting.
So in the context of that, what's it been like to work with students and you're working with them on a totally different language and approach and in theory, uh, and obviously both the schools that you've taught at, Andrews and Notre Dame, we both know from personal experience many graduates who've gone on to really tremendous success, who have found their niche in the world, working with architecture in a different way than is promoted in the standard in the profession. Does it feel a bit like does it feel like you're a revolutionary? Does it feel like you're just fighting the good fight, or is it just, you're doing something every day that you believe in and enjoy, and that's all there is to it?
Well, it feels like we're for the world, right? We're for truth, goodness, beauty. We're for the world against the world, or we're against the world as it is,
Yeah.
on behalf of the form of the world that we hope to make. And the interesting thing about education and Notre Dame is that, and I think this is true of Andrews too. I mean, I haven't been at Andrews for 20 years, although obviously I keep tabs.
Mhm.
But the graduates of Andrews and of Notre Dame have no trouble getting jobs in the profession. That they are in demand. They get higher starting salaries. I mean, that's just a kind of a mark, though, of what they can do,
Mhm.
because they pass the licensing exams with, much higher frequency, first attempt. And so they're really ready to work when they go into these offices. And the offices themselves, though, are still kind of a little. They're not a niche thing. They've actually grown. There's a number of offices, but if you take the Notre Dame Career Fair, the annual career fair, we have every year about 60 graduates, and we get about 70 firms
Hmm.
that come and are looking, to hire our graduates. And so I want to say that the they're doing good work in the world, and they're ready to do it. And some are more. And I think we have sort of two personality types. One type just kind of wants to make beautiful things in whatever context they can make them, and then there's the type that really do want to change the world. And we like to try to convey to them that those two things aren't antithetical. But that's my sense of the personality types that come through, and I love them all.
Yeah.
But it's I want to say that the harvest is great, but the laborers are few. The work is there's so much work to do and so few people doing it. And the real frustration is that we're experiencing. I've been experiencing, especially with some students who've come through the program, and who are they're very enthusiastic about their vocation as architects and urbanists and as builders. It's that there's so many working parts. I mean, sprawl is such a it is such a snafu. It is such a cluster F
Mhm.
of institutions and practices that it's just very hard to hit it systemically. And so I think that the way to have success at it, the only way that I can think of to have success at it on a sustained basis, is to find places that are a little below the radar, that have good bones. And you go in and you find a way to become a part of the community, right? You don't become part of the
Mhm.
you don't you're not the hero swooping in from on high, but you're in a place for 30 years, 40 years, and you're actually doing design development stuff. I mean, the models are people like Dan Camp, or like Robert Davis, or but people who are sort of embedded in a place. And anyway, so it's a long-term cultural project, and
Yeah.
we're turning it over to the young people.
Yeah.
So
And, even if I was just to give a plug, for Notre Dame, for Andrews too. I mean, I think what you speak to was my experience as a former employer, and I hired a Andrews grad who was phenomenal. The Notre Dame people. I just recently had Jen Settle and Jen Griffin on the podcast
oh,
here. I mean,
they're super.
and the work. Obviously, Dan Perolick's a good friend. Um,
Right.
the quality of the work that they produce as graduates just far exceeds, even irrespective of what you think of the designs or themselves. The quality of the work that comes out of the school is incredible, and they seem to be students that are much more prepared to really contribute to working in a company right away. And so, I mean, that's just kind of been my experience.
Yeah. Well, and the thing that we're proud of, I think, and in some ways, I mean, we aspire to, is that it's not only that they it's not only that they come out knowing how to design well, but they understand the legal context into which they're going.
Mhm.
They understand the kinds of things that need to be done in preparation, or to make it possible to do walkable mixed use human settlements that in most places remain illegal.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Have you, been in touch with or followed, colleagues that are trying to have been establishing a program here nearby at, Benedictine College in Atchison, Kansas?
yeah, yeah. So this is interesting. There are a number of other schools that are trying to do traditional programs. I
Mm.
mean, and it's interesting, because it really it also underscores two things, both with the interest and the importance of the institutional context.
Mhm.
Because what we're finding, somewhat dismayingly, is that even where there's something that gets established, it doesn't necessarily have legs, right? And so I know there was a wonderful program that Chris Miller ran at Judson,
Mhm.
but there wasn't as much institutional support as he needed. And Benedictine is still early on. We get a lot of students, undergrads from Benedictine, and they're excellent. I don't know if you ever knew Paul Monson.
I don't think so.
He was one of our early Notre Dame grads, and he's Latter Day Saint, and he's out in Utah running a traditional urban design program, a pretty thorough one, from what I can
Hmm.
tell from the work that they're doing at Utah Valley University,
Hmm.
which is a state school, but it's a little below the radar. Catholic U has initiated a new classical program. It kind of runs in parallel with their longstanding modernist program. But this is all good in part because it's opportunities for Notre Dame grads to teach, and that I was going to say, our graduates get jobs in offices, but academia is basically closed
Hmm.
to them.
Hmm.
And so the exceptions are some of these newer schools.
Interesting.
So yeah, so we're and really what we need to be doing, and our new dean, actually he's not that new anymore, Stefanos Palazoides, recognizes that we need to be in a certain way seeding other institutions. That sounds like we're kind of more important than probably what we actually are. But just getting more people who sort of understand walkable mixed use urbanism and its relationship to architecture, getting those kinds of people into academic programs where they're more than just a visitor and they have one studio, because it really takes some formation, the kind of thing that you were describing about the people who come into your office and are kind of ready to go. That's a result of a curriculum where they get introduced to concepts at an early age. They get reinforced throughout the curriculum. They're reinforced by their travel, and they're reinforced by the complexity of the projects that they do as they go through the curriculum. So that when I have students read Space and Anti-Space
Hmm.
by Steve Peterson in every class that I teach, and when you're assigning it to freshmen, their eyes glaze over. They don't know what in the world he's talking about, and then they read it the second time, and or they hear someone else talking about it, and they know they've heard these terms, and so they perk up a little bit, and they read it for the third time, and I get some of this, and then you take them someplace, you show them Rome, or you show them a spatial city, a traditional city, and they have a way to understand, right, what they're looking at, and then they come back and they're doing an urban design project and they're ready to design, using those tools informed by both the things that they've read and the things that they've seen, and I should say the things that they've drawn.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Let's shift and tie together our interests in traditional design and baseball for a little bit, just because we have such a fantastic shared history in this world.
we
And
do.
the World Series and the World Series just wrapped up, so the timing is perfect. The Rangers are
Good.
world champs with a pretty remarkable run, and how
Yeah.
about Corey Seager? Two-time
Oh my
World Series
goodness.
MVP, unbelievable.
Unbelievable.
Um,
Yep. Really, really exciting. I mean, and again, Texas, one of those teams that had never won a World Series
yeah,
and had lost two heartbreakers, right? One pitch away,
yeah.
right? Like 2 years in a row. And that's heartbreaking. Although and I should say, as a Cub fan, I'm sympathetic.
Yeah,
So,
well, but as a Cub fan,
and as a Royals fan, so
I'm a Royals fan. We both have been blessed with having World Series champs in fairly recent years. So
back to back.
yeah, so
So
we've had those successes, which is nice,
it is
and
nice. Covers a lot of pain.
hopefully they will come again at some point. Right now, our team is looking as dreadful as they probably ever have, but that's just kind of the ups and downs of baseball.
Yep.
So,
Yep.
I can't remember how many people I have given your book, City Baseball Magic, to, that you wrote quite a long time ago now. I wonder if you wouldn't mind just giving sort of a Cliff's Notes version of your thoughts. You wrote this book at the time when the White Sox were going to build a new ballpark, New Comiskey. At the
Right.
time, I don't even know what it's called these days.
Guaranteed rate field for the time being.
Guaranteed right field.
So
What a name.
it has an arrow pointing down. It's supposed to be low interest rates, but you can't miss the symbolism of the White Sox performance. It's tragic comic,
That's
but
fantastic.
uh,
Um,
uh,
but so
not
you put
really.
together this book that was basically like a counter proposal to that, and I
Yeah.
wonder if you could just take a minute and talk about what your thinking was at the time.
Yeah. Well, I didn't realize it at the time, but it's kind of a warm up for my professional life, for my vocation, which was I had come to Chicago from a modernist program at Virginia. I worked for Helmut Jahn, and was really miserable there. They were very talented at doing what they do. I had a lot to learn, but I wasn't. I realized that I wasn't enthusiastic about the city that it was making, but I was still trying to sort all of those things out. Eventually, I left there after about 3.5 years, and worked in another office for about a year, and then left that as well, and just tried to begin cobbling together a way to make a living. But in that time, I had, and this was owing to my architectural education, and owing to the fact that I'd lived in Boston for 4 years prior to going to architecture school, and owing to being a Cub fan. And even though I had never been to Wrigley until I was 21 years old,
Hmm,
but I went to Fenway a lot when I was in Boston. And I had no way of kind of understanding or explaining the difference between those kinds of ballparks and Dodger Stadium, where I had seen most of my games, but then all the other places that were the concrete donuts from the '60s and early '70s, and and architecture school kind of gave me a vocabulary for thinking about that. I recognized that just looking at it, that of course, Fenway is the way that it is, Wrigley is the way that it is because they're constrained by ordinary city blocks, and the shapes of these blocks, and they varied. I mean, there's a big difference between Fenway and Wrigley, and it got me interested in going back and looking at the generation of ballparks of which Wrigley and Fenway were part. So that from 1909 to 1923, there were, gosh, I can't remember, it was 14 or 15 ballparks that were built, and some of them, and these were the first um, concrete and steel.
hmm,
And they were really steel frame parks on concrete foundations, but they were fireproof. That was the big deal, because the ballparks prior to the early 20th century were wooden. They had their origins in the mid 19th century, but the wooden ones burned a
yeah.
lot, and so it was a big deal to start making these fireproof stadiums, and they were built on city blocks. And interestingly enough, this being the period of the American City Beautiful, a lot of them were classical,
Mhm.
right, in their facades and their ornamentation, which is interesting because it's not they're not classical in the sense it's a weird stadium to think of it as a classical
Yeah.
thing, but they were making train stations out of Roman baths, right?
Yep.
So at the time, and pretty good ones too.
Mhm.
Um, so I did a study of that, and I wrote an essay for the University of Illinois Chicago uh, architecture school annual publication called what was it called? It was called "From Elysian Fields to Domed Stadiums," and it
Yeah.
was a history of ballparks. Um, uh, and anyway, it got the attention of some people, and I thought, well, when I kind of went out on my own, I thought, because I realized that this is all introduction, right? This is that the White Sox were talking about building a new ballpark, and I knew that they were going to build that. What they wanted was a replica of Royal Stadium.
Yeah.
Actually, they wanted it in the western suburbs. Jerry Reinsdorf loved Kauffman Stadium, and um, and they lost the referendum, and so they made a deal with the city that they would build a new ballpark across the street from the old Comiskey Park. And although they kept it kind of under wraps, we knew that that's where it was going to go because we'd seen things in the paper, but they denied that a site had been chosen. But everybody knew where I knew where it was anyway, and they uh, and this was a little bit under wraps, but I could see what was coming, and I thought, okay, well, how would you do a, a, how would you do a ballpark in a traditional neighborhood? Because this was the point about, not, it wasn't just that Wrigley and Fenway were on city blocks, is that they were on city blocks in the context of neighborhoods, right? It was a traditional walkable mixed use neighborhood, often on a streetcar line or a subway line or
Right.
something like that.
Which, by the way, is different from the way we talk about ballparks, let's say in the last 30 years, as the downtown ballpark.
Right,
Those
right,
traditional
right.
parks that you're talking about weren't really in the downtowns of those cities.
No, no, they were on the periphery of the city, but they were in a neighborhood in a network of streets and blocks.
Yeah.
And so yeah, so the proposition was to do a counter proposal to show how a contemporary baseball park, because baseball parks at the time and then and now are built to make money, and the money driver at the time was the creation of luxury suites. And so the challenge was to make a traditional ballpark in a traditional neighborhood. And the other thing is the issue of scale, right? Because the new ballparks are about 50% larger in footprint and about 3 times as large in terms of square footage and volume. And so our objective was to show how you could make a new ballpark that was compact and that could generate the same amount of revenue and could be done in a way that was better for the city and that would work in the city. And so we tried a couple of years to get grants. Finally, got one from the Graham Foundation, a small one, that got a bigger one from the National National Endowment for the Arts, who were actually
Hmm.
very helpful. I'm trying to remember the name of the woman who was the head of it, because she's been on Notre Dame boards and things. I'm blanking on her name anyway, but got that, and hired a couple of people, and we worked. We made models and drawings and everything, and presented it publicly. The White Sox were completely uninterested. I had this sense and this is before the new urbanism, but I had this sense that good urbanism. A lot of people were suspicious of it because they had their own particular interests, but that it actually could solve a lot of common problems in an urban kind of way. And so part of my thought in all this was, as I was doing the work, I was trying to identify all the stakeholders that I could think of that were involved with that. And it was the preservationists, and it was the Parks District people, and it was the aldermen, and it was the White Sox. But I mean, there were a dozen, at least 12 to 15 stakeholders that I identified, and I had a series of meetings with them sequentially, one at a time,
Hmm.
right? And it was only in retrospect later that I realized that I was moving toward the idea of a charrette, but the problem, but I was using kind of the old assumption that you could do this one at a time, and that what you and later on in life realize that what you need to do is you need to get the people, the stakeholders in the room, so that you can do all of this stuff. They can evaluate it. You can have serious conversations and all that. Anyway, that was kind of interesting, but it didn't go anywhere. But I wrote it up and published it. It was published by Steve Lehman at the Minneapolis Review of Baseball, which was modeled after the New York Review of Books.
Interesting.
It's a great little publication out of Minneapolis, and he printed it in the journal, and then he did a couple of thousand off prints that we mailed out to sports writers and public officials. And John Norquist saw it and invited me up to do a proposal for Milwaukee, but working with NJTB, NBTJ.
H
It was the
and was that NBBJ?
NBB. No. It was
HNTB?
It's HNTB.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, a firm I worked at years ago. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So, well, and HNTB was they were the mothership, right,
Yeah.
of HOK Sport. And then no, NBBJ was out in Seattle. I did some consulting work for Seattle out there. But all of that was an education too, because John felt himself kind of a little hamstrung. I mean, he put me to work with them, which is just not possible. And so I wound up doing I just did a kind of little independent study on that. But that sort of set off. That was in that period of the late 80s and early 90s, right, when teaching jobs were were drying up, and so I was kind of making my living that way in a sense. But I went 2 or 3 years trying to kind of go head to head with HOK, which
Mhm.
just is a severe headache. It's a severe headache because they had it just anyway because they were a client friendly architect, and I guess I wasn't. I was an ideologist. I was an urbanist. Anyway, it was republished again in '99. The White Sox went ahead and built their thing. It's interesting. I every year and a half or so I get a call from a journalist, right, who's just discovered it, and they want to do a long feature story on the ballpark that could have been.
Huh,
It's
interesting.
it's just it's really weird. I mean, there's a lot of there's a and I'm not so vain as to let's see. I'm vain enough, right, that I'll follow blogs and stuff that write about these things. So I know that there are a lot of people out there who actually know the project and baseball fans who like it. So I'm you
And it probably
I'm,
helps
I'm hoping I'm hoping you'll get a chance.
and it probably helps the cause that New Comiskey turned out to be a pretty horrible stadium and
Well, yeah,
yeah,
no, that's the point.
yeah.
That's the point. Yeah, it's not just that they see the counter proposal. It's that they look at the reality and they say, "Oh my God, this is it didn't have to be this way."
Right.
So
But the good so then one of the many good outcomes of that was it eventually led to a group in Boston, to give you a call,
yeah,
and I wonder if you
yeah,
I mean, I feel like while we're together, we have to talk about Fenway Park,
we do.
so
Yeah,
which is I have
yeah,
often told people was probably the lowest paying gig of my career, but the one probably the one that I feel the best about that I will remember forever.
yeah. So there were we were. Let's see. Kevin and I were the group of design professionals that were there. We came to describe ourselves, I guess, or we're described as the Fenway Seven. And it was interesting because there were people that I had worked with. I was the one responsible for putting together the team, and it was people that I'd worked with before, plus a couple of others, plus one guy from college who just called us up and said, "Can I come work on this?" And we would say, "Sure, come on." And and then there was a group called Save Fenway Park who'd been very active. They were very Boston fans are have a deserved reputation for being intense,
Mhm,
and they were intense and wonderful. And I have to mention specifically Dan Wilson, who was the head of Save Fenway Park, but also Erica Tarlin, who became kind of our
mhm.
our godmother.
Yeah, and still emails
There
us.
and that's right. No, still she keeps us informed about all the development that's going on around Fenway Park.
Yeah,
That is, I would say, lamentably at scale different than what we had hoped,
yeah,
but that we had imagined would that the development would take place. But anyway, it was again, it's a long story. The Red Sox ownership, the Yawkey family had owned the Red Sox until Tom Yawkey died, I think in the late '70s or early '80s. It went into a trust, with a 20-year lifespan called the Yawkey Trust. And around 1999, they began approaching the date where they had to sell the trust. Uh, they began lobbying for a new baseball park, that they had to tear Fenway Park down, that it was a liability. And it's amazing to think that even now that was seen as a liability, although there's a lot of precedent for it. So
sure.
the and so Save Fenway Park went on a campaign to save Fenway Park, and eventually our paths crossed. I met with them. They invited me. I told them what I thought would be a way to proceed that would involve a charrette and would involve people who were not only baseball fans, but they were good architects, and they cared about urbanism, and they understood. And again, it's not when you just sort of think about urban ballparks on constrained sites, it's not rocket science. You just have to sort of think through the implications of that once you see it, and that you're working within constraints. I mean, it's an object lesson in how you make good things out of constraints, how oysters make pearls,
Mm,
and so anyway, we did this 10-day thing, and we were underpaid. But Kevin, you're not the only person that has told me that this was like the most satisfying experience
Yeah.
that they'd had. And I think part of what made it satisfying was that the process was great.
Yeah.
And we worked 16-hour days, and we walked a mile and a half, fortunately down Commonwealth Avenue
Mhm.
to the venue. And and what happened was, and this was kind of against the tide of even the sports writers. The sports writers in Boston were longtime Red Sox fans, proponents of dear old Fenway Park, but they bought in. By the time we were there, they had bought into the Fenway Park has to be demolished for the sake of the team, for the future of the team, and uh, and so we were really isolated, and we did the work 10 days, presented it publicly, and then we just kind of waited. And what happened? It was providence, or it was just a break, or whatever. But the politics changed, right? And the expense of the proposal got so great that the state legislature could not, they couldn't support it financially. And so the bottom line was that the trust sold the team,
Mhm.
and they sold it to a team that was headed by John Henry, and who are the other guys? Was the guy who was from San Diego,
Yeah.
and anyway, I think an Italian name. What, Larry Lucchese? Is that
That sounds
no?
right.
Anyway, so it was a kind of triumvirate. But John, I just said his name.
Henry.
John Henry. John Henry was the money guy, and he had been the former owner of the Marlins. Anyway, they bought the team, and they said about when they were asked about Fenway, they said, we're gonna wait and see. We're gonna take a close look at it and see what we have. And and it turned out really well for a lot of reasons. I mean, one was we had drawings there. They were open to talking to Erica Tarlin. In fact, they hired Erica Tarlin of Save Fenway Park just as an advisor, and she brought with them all these drawings with all these ideas. And I think that the most prominent of them was the monster seats
Yeah.
on the left field seats, on left field wall. If you know Boston, you know that.
Mhm.
But
Yeah,
and so
worth
that
noting that idea came out of our, say, Fenway Park
it,
charrette.
it did, and it's anyway they grabbed onto that one first, and they built those. And in 2003, right, it was the first year that the seats, and we had suggested in the charrette that if they built those seats, which you might get 300 seats, that they could sell for as high as $50
Yeah.
a seat.
Kinda hilarious in retrospect, yeah.
Yeah, right. I think they auction them now. I don't know, but um, but but they invited us to a game at the near the end of the season, and so we have pictures of Kevin and Pat Pinnell
Mhm.
and Rolando Llanes. Howard Decker couldn't make it, but but then they continued doing these incremental changes within the ballpark, and they're not the wealthiest franchise in baseball, but they're in the top two or three, and and uh, and the ballpark is a huge moneymaker for them,
Yeah.
and it's led to uh, I would almost say an overdevelopment of the real estate around Fenway, but it remains a ballpark that is part of it's become it's like a dense urban neighborhood ballpark, and it mainly because of its scale and because of its configuration and because of its constraints. So that I would say, if I have a professional success story, and it's not just mine, but it's all the people that participated in it. But that's high on my list too, Kevin.
Yeah, I mean, well, it was incredible to be a part of it, even though I actually got sick during the charrette. Poor Pat Pinnell had to hear me coughing, all night long. I ended up
Oh,
when I got home, I had diagnosed I had walking pneumonia. Uh,
oh my
it
gosh,
was a crazy situation, but it was totally worth
it's
it, and,
yeah, the things we do for love,
yeah.
right?
I don't know if you remember, but during the charrette, we also went to a baseball game, uh,
We did.
and do you
We
remember
were doing reconnaissance.
who
Yeah,
the team was they played? The Red Sox played?
I
It
don't.
was the Royals.
Was it?
Yeah, yeah. So, they're
But this is during the charrette,
yeah.
because I'm trying to remember who they played in the game that we saw, which the Red Sox in the ninth inning were down 4-2, and their second baseman, I can't remember his name, he became a Cub a year or two later. He had a two-run homer,
Yeah,
and then in the 10th, Big Poppy hit a home run, hit a walk-off homer to win it,
yeah,
and we were watching from the seats,
yeah, that's
so
right. That was
it was a great game.
something else.
Yeah,
Yeah, so
I bet there is.
we're having a stadium discussion again in Kansas City now,
Yeah,
and we have relatively new owners. They bought the team, I guess, about 2 years ago. Led by it's a local group, basically led by John Sherman, but it's really a collection of 20 or 30 investors, and they are ready to abandon Kauffman Stadium and build a new ballpark. And they've narrowed it down to two sites: one that's in the downtown and one that's in North Kansas City, which is just across the river. So it's been a fascinating thing to watch uh,
across the river
in Missouri.
in Kansas,
In
in
Missouri,
Missouri.
so
Okay.
North Kansas City, Missouri, which is its own municipality, a very small municipality of about 4,000 people, um, but with a, it has a nice little downtown, and it's spitting difference distance from downtown Kansas City, so you can actually get some of
Yeah.
those downtown views. But those are the two sites they've honed in on, and we're all kind of sitting around now playing a waiting game to see what they're going to announce and how they think they're going to finance it. All of which will probably be subject to a public vote down the road. But
Yeah.
it's interesting how these things come around. Uh,
It is interesting how they come around and how they come around in different historic, epics, epochs.
yeah,
The because I was kind of an agnostic when I started out in this about new ballparks versus old ballparks and historic preservation, and also about public financing. That these were, in my thought, these were local political decisions. That if the voters were behind it, could warrant public funding. And I've really become a, a much harder core opponent of public financing of ballparks. And for one thing, just because the industry standard is so expensive,
yeah, yeah,
and for the other thing is that I've become a I've become a proponent of questioning, if not ending, Major League Baseball's monopoly exemption.
hmm
And and I'm also, I hate to say this as a Bears fan, I almost, because I wonder if the model isn't community ownership similar to what the Packers
yeah,
do in Green Bay.
yeah.
I don't know. I mean, it's this whole, just there's so many things that are that are calling for public attention that I'm not sure that financing billionaire sports franchises is one of them.
Yeah, it's
But I preach. Let me stop.
no, I mean, it's like so many things. What used to be privately run endeavors,
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
were at a certain scale that worked really well in cities and were very competitive. They've now become enormously bloated, public-private partnerships where the
Yeah,
public really is expected to underwrite, an enormous amount of the cost and the risk, and yet, you have these teams that are all basically owned by billionaires that are reaping the
right,
rewards. And I mean,
right.
it's it's
It's
distasteful. A lot of it is. I can't deny it.
well, it's yeah, no. I mean, it's not just distasteful, but it's also kind of financially problematic. I mean,
Yeah,
the two the Cubs and the Red Sox both own their own ballparks,
yeah,
right? And to my knowledge, they have not ever received public money for rehabbing their parks. And like this comes out like in contrast to the White Sox, which play in a facility where they rent it and it's owned by a state authority.
hmm
I mean, the Cubs and the Red Sox, they have all kinds of events that go on there, right, during the year. They have. I saw Springsteen.
yeah,
I'm sort of the last guy to see Springsteen at Wrigley Field. This past summer, and the White Sox can't do that, right?
yeah,
Anyway, it's just you when you own your own facility, you have a lot of opportunities, but
yeah.
that's a whole. It just I keep thinking, and I have to give Major League Baseball credit. Their ingenuity, because I keep thinking they're going to run into a ceiling, right? About the affordability, what they can afford to do before it all kind of comes tumbling down. But it's not happening yet. I still don't think it's unlimited, but we'll see. I don't know. I've been wrong about a lot of things.
Well, there certainly was the beginnings of a trend, maybe 15 years ago, for some of the newer ballparks to be smaller. Um, or at least less seating capacity, we should say.
Yes,
Uh,
that's the distinction to make because the footprints are
the
not
footprints are
apples.
still large, but yeah, I
Yeah,
think about the one in Pittsburgh, which I think is
yeah,
35,000 seats or something
yeah.
like that.
San Francisco is like what 42 or
Yeah.
something like that. Yeah,
So it's going to be interesting to see what plays out with this situation with the Royals, because uh, they're kind of at the epicenter, or have been for a lot of these changes for 50 years. Because Kauffman Stadium and Arrowhead Stadium really broke the mold of the shared use donut, and
yeah.
then the entire sports architecture industry essentially was created here and
Based
revolves around Kansas City, which is a
absolutely.
pretty incredible. I mean, for locally, for selfish people in Kansas City, it's wonderful. It's created
Yeah,
a ton of business and everything else, but a lot of those new stadiums were designed by Kansas City firms, and now as it comes back around to replacing or potentially replacing Kauffman, it's going to be interesting to see what that model looks like for a small market like Kansas City.
yeah. There must be huge competition
Oh yeah,
for that job. I mean, it's just and not just in Kansas City, but especially in Kansas City.
yeah, yeah. I think they're,
It's really
the team has been working with Populous pretty closely on that.
yeah,
We'll see how things evolve.
yeah,
When we designed and built a new arena here downtown, about that must have been about 15 years ago. They basically created a consortium of local sports architects to kind of work together on it in order
yeah,
to spread the wealth a little bit, which was smart.
yeah,
And
yeah.
we'll
I
see what
think so.
happens with a potentially $1 billion endeavor for a new baseball stadium. Uh,
It's yeah, it's really hard to say what happens. I mean, again, a lot of the I'm a big believer that a lot of the most innovative stuff happens in, you know, not on the coasts,
yeah,
even the third coast,
yeah, yeah,
and so it's it'll be very interesting to see how that plays out, given all the history that you've described and all the history that
yeah.
you are embedded in. So
Well, Phil, we've done about an hour. I'm loath to bring up another topic because I've got two or three other topics in mind, but I know we'll spend at least another half an hour getting into them. I really, we'll have to do this at a future day because I'd love to dive more into the whole question of like land value taxation, which is something I know you're really interested
mm,
in,
yeah.
and a lot of work you've done related to coding and planning, and the tie in between those topics. So
Yeah, there's the whole aspect of my career that of that trajectory that City Baseball Magic set me on. It's
yeah.
because it's like a microcosm of my interest in Chicago. So
Well, and we could certainly talk about Chicago a lot as well, and
yeah,
which I still maintain is the best big city in America, and we just happened to visit there a few weeks ago for a conference, and just again remarked at what an incredible city it is, and so
yeah,
livable for a big city as well.
yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
so
It's true.
we have other things to discuss, but I think
I'm
we should probably wrap this version. So what I do like to do is uh, I ask my guests a final question. Since I call this the Messy City podcast, I like to ask people what comes to mind when I use that phrase, which obviously is meant to uh, sort of be an homage to places that are less perfectly planned and maybe more bottom up in nature. Is there
mhm.
a neighborhood, a city, a place that immediately comes to mind when I talk about that for you?
Well, most every place uh, that at a certain scale. I mean, most every place of scale at any size. I mean, all the planned cities that are the centers, and you're going to get a long answer here. All the,
That's fine.
all the
I would expect
all the
nothing
planned.
less.
I know, right? I'm sorry. So, I mean, all the planned cities that become the center of big cities, right? They were all actually planned. But the way that they grew was messy. And so if you ask me about messy city, as opposed to say thinking of small town or
Mhm,
village or hamlet, which again have a similar form, but they're not as messy.
mhm,
That the messy city is about. I think the things that I think about are words like subsidiarity and distributism and localism,
mhm,
right? And these are all they're actually all parts of a philosophical view of the world that kind of is about it's about decentralized power. It's about multiple centers. It's about a lot of people with the freedom to do a lot of projects, but they don't do them as individuals. They do them as kind of subsidiary groups within the city. And again, and it's really, for me, this really goes back to Aristotle, because Aristotle, he says that the best life for human beings is the life of moral and intellectual virtue lived in community with others, and typically in a city, in a polis. What he means by polis, again, is something about the size of a neighborhood, and the way that he defines a polis is as a community of communities.
Hmm.
And so he says, every community seeks some good. The polis, because it seeks the highest good, as a community of communities, is the highest human community that we have. So those are the words that's what I think of when I hear messy city. I love it, by the
Interesting.
way. And which is, it confuses some people, because I'm 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 interested in urban design. I'm
Right.
interested in sort of
And planning.
planning public
Yeah.
space. Yeah,
Yeah.
but there have to be a lot of actors. I mean,
Hmm.
which also kind of creates a common culture. So I love Messy City.
Well,
That's what I think.
you're speaking my language there, and it just makes me make a note to think that we need to also talk in greater depth about subsidiarity, and localism at some point.
I would be happy to do that. I would love to come back. It's been a privilege to be here today. So thank you for the
Well,
invitation.
thanks so much. It's great to see you again after too much time away. So, Philip, Bess, thanks very much. Take care.
My pleasure. You too, Kevin.